All right, so in this video, what we're going to do is see how we can make gems. So we'll talk about modeling gems, how we can light them, creating materials, as well as rendering them using Redshift. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so here's essentially what we're going to be creating once we talk about the modeling, lighting, materials, as well as rendering of these different gems. Now, I should also stress the importance here of using the correct values. So you are going to want to Google the values for whatever gem you're trying to create. So for instance, here is diamond. You will see that you can find its refractive index or IOR to input into our material, as well as the ABE number for dispersion. That is also really important. And sometimes you can find them on a single website like this one, refractiveindex.info. There are other websites that just say list the IOR, which is a great place to start, but you will also want that ABE number as well. And you can see you can just kind of find the IOR for pretty much anything you want. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. And we're just going to start here with a plain view, an empty scene, and we're going to start basic. So what I'm going to do is just create a platonic, okay? And really I can choose any one of these options, although not any one of them, but several of these will work. So for instance, you could do this kind of triangular pyramid shape, obviously a cube, not the best. Really, when we're talking about gems, you want something that is faceted or has, more of these angular sides. So the more of those you have, the better your gem will look. And while I don't plan to, get into a lot of detail with that, there are really some interesting ways of kind of subdividing these different shapes, triangulating them to get more facets, to get more sides. So definitely think about that as you are creating your shape here. The more facets, the more light you're going to be able to catch, and the better your gem will look. So I could just go with this dodecahedron here for one. What else can we do? We can create a second one here. Perhaps icosahedron could also work. And let's make an actual diamond. So what I'm going to do is create, say, a cylinder. Quite a few different ways you could approach starting this. I'm going to take the height segments down to 1 and the rotation segments down to 6. Right, so that's looking good. I'm going to go into a side view here, actually a front view, so that I can see this from the side. Actually, maybe we do want one height segment. Actually, probably a second as well. We'll just go with 2. Can always add more if we like with something as simple as this. And what I'm going to do is take these bottom points and scale them down. And for these top points, scale them in a little bit and move them down. And that essentially is our diamond shape. Now, we really should weld all these together. So I will select them, right click, find my weld tool, and then just click, and there you go. So we could scale this up. We can change the proportions of it if we like, if we think it's a little bit too tall, because I actually do. Maybe something like that. And there we go. So that is a quick look at how we can model a simple gem shape. And like I said, the more faceting, the better. And there's some good videos already out there about how you can come in and, line cut some things in order to make, something that has some more faceting. And what's important with this faceting is also what we are doing with our Phong angle. So be careful with your Phong tag that you come in here and turn it down enough to where you are getting hard edges between our different sides here, because that is also going to help. So for instance, now we have something that's a little bit more faceted, and that's going to catch a little bit more light. So that is one approach to creating a more realistic gem, is to have more of that faceting. But I'm going to keep it simple for today. So we will just kind of roll with this. But Phong angle, super important here. Now, something else that perhaps isn't the most realistic way of creating these, but definitely can help things look good, is to bevel our sides just a bit. And it's important to kind of bevel without smoothing. And I'm going to be doing this using the Bevel Deformer. So I will create that and drop it on our cylinder. And once I get the settings I like here, I will copy it to our other objects. So you can see we're beveling, but it's not quite smooth and it's not doing every edge. So I'm going to uncheck use angle, and that should bevel every edge. You can see we actually still get that little bit right there. That's fine. But I'm going to increase the subdivisions to say 3. And that's great, but I still think we're getting a bit too much smoothing. So I'm going to come down here and check some of my topology options, specifically the Fong break rounding, maybe Fong break miters. I think the rounding is, well, see, I'm not sure I like that either. So we may just keep this. I think with our Fong tag set the way it is, it's doing okay. And we can adjust that Fong tag if we really need to. But we want to maintain those hard edges along with kind of the rounded bevels as well. You know, that kind of seems counterintuitive. So yeah, now I will duplicate that out and copy it to all my other gems. And there we have it. Those are our gems. So now what I'm going to do is create a disk, and I'm going to scale this up. Something like that. This will eventually be what our gems land on. And what we're going to do is select our disk and add a few more segments here just to smooth it out a little bit on the edges. Now, lighting for this, I'm going to be using Redshift. I am going to switch my render to Redshift here, and I know that's a bit off screen. So Redshift, and that way, when I come over here and create a dome light, everything should be pretty good. And lighting gems, really important. So I like to use the dome light as kind of like our fill and rim lights, and then add an area light is the key light. So you could grab an HDRI from the content browser or asset browser. I'm going to use some grayscale ones. So I will just load one in here. I think will look good. And the more light sources you have, the better. So in my case, I'm going to use one of the metals collection and find something here. Honestly, I probably should wait until after I get some materials in there, but just to try and move things along, that should work for the lighting for right now. And I can go ahead and start that. So we should be able to see what we're working with here, hopefully soon. There we go. Not too bad. And that leaves me with my area light to add. So what I'm going to do is create a null, and that null is going to be the target for what I want my light to look at, since we don't really have a target light in here. So I'm going to create an area light. And if you want to turn off the illumination of an area light, what you want to do is either set the top stoplight to red, or what you can do is in the object tab here, come here to preview and uncheck illumination. And that way you don't have to worry about seeing that. As often that preview just isn't very helpful or can actually get in your way. So to connect the area light to our null to make it a target light, we're going to go to animation tags and we're going to choose target. I know that's a bit cut off. And then in our target tag, we're going to drag in our null as the target object. And now it will always look at that null. So I can move my light a little bit, maybe to one side like this. And if I did ever want to move the null, you can see that the area light will follow it. So let's see what we got here. I may just switch to my render view. I feel like that's a little bit easier, faster perhaps than using my perspective view. That definitely started faster. So cool, that's looking pretty good for right now, but we may want to make some adjustments once we get our materials in there. And I'm not too worried about the shadows in it floating. So for the materials, it's pretty basic. We're going to go materials. We're going to create a standard material, although you could do this with the other Redshift material as well. Can just go ahead and dock that node editor there. And what we're going to do is find our transmission property and set the weight to 1. And that's going to give us glass. And just so we can see what we're doing, let's apply this to all 3 of our objects. You can see we have a nice glass here. The one little trick with the standard material is that it does have roughness by default. And so for a gem, we would want to turn that down. And so we can see what we have now. We have these nice solid looking objects. Remember, we want to change the IOR. So something like 2.4. Okay. We can always refer back to our list though. Let's see. Diamond was 2.4175. I mean, look, I'm all about being precise and realistic, but ultimately I don't think that 1.0175 is going to make a huge difference. And that looks pretty good. And what we're missing now is the colors, the dispersion from this. And once again, if I refer back to that, we can see that's 55.30. So I will go a bit lower in my transmission property and copy that value and paste it into my dispersion or ABE. And there we go. That's looking pretty good. In terms of the material, I'm starting to see some of those colors separate. Okay. Now, along with everything we've done so far, a big part of rendering gems is going to be your actual render settings. You'll notice I have some of these darker areas, and that's where Redshift is actually stopping rendering. So light is bouncing through here so many times, it's reflecting the gems next to it, but at some point it just stops after it bounces around a certain number of times. And the exact number of times you can find in your Redshift settings, both in the basic setting here, the combined depth, all right, and transparency depth. And if you're in the advanced tab, you can find it under globals. And so these are the settings I'm talking about right here. So let's just save this to our, shoot, I forget the name of this guy. What do they call it? Snapshot. That way we can come back to it. But what I'm going to do is just crank these all the way up just so we can see the difference. Okay, so refraction, transparency. Okay, and don't get me wrong, this is going to take a lot longer to render, so we don't just want to raise these as much as possible. But you can see the difference it's having here, both just in terms of the lighting and the way our gems look. And so that's a pretty good comparison at this point. So I will copy this. And you can see the difference. Notice how those darker areas are no longer dark. And this can happen with any transparent material, but you do seem to notice it a lot more in gems. Now, like I said, I don't want to use these values and just turn them up as high as they go. So, maybe we can try a value like 24 for each of these. And you can see there's a value for combined, both reflection and refraction. You have individual values for those, as well as transparency. Okay. And notice, just by raising these to 24, I got just about the same thing. Not quite. I'm still losing, some detail in those smaller, darker areas. So maybe we try 32. And if I really wanted to break this down, I could go kind of value by value here to see which one I need to increase the most. But you essentially just want to turn these up as high as you need to. Eventually there is diminishing returns. And so, yeah, I don't need to go all the way to 64 or whatever it is. I can just keep this at 32 and this works pretty well. Now, you may have heard of something before called caustics. Caustics should give us some interesting patterns as the light passes through our gems or other transparent materials. And honestly, caustics aren't something I've dealt with a lot. They're supposed to be on here. Our trace depths are as high as possible, and we're not really getting too much. Maybe a little bit here. I suspect if we lowered these a little bit closer to the ground, we might get some. But those caustics really seem to we get what we get in terms of Redshift. And even cranking the number of photons doesn't give us that much more of them. So don't worry too much about that. Another thing you could potentially try to increase here would be our global illumination, both our trace depth and our brute force rays. The trace depth, as you'll see, does kind of impact the floor a little bit in terms of brightening that up, getting rid of our shadows. I don't always think that's a good look, but I do think turning it up more than the default value of 4 can be important. So I would start maybe with 8. Perhaps even 12, and you're starting to get a good kind of combination now. Okay, and once again, those caustic photons really don't make that much of a difference. What we could experiment with here, if we really wanted to, would be to have our dome light not cast any refraction, and just have all of it come from the area light and that type of thing. And have actually, our dome light isn't emitting photons. So let's check our area light and make sure, aha, there we go. So you can see now we should be getting more caustics, but even with that, we really aren't. So there's probably a bit more we could do with caustics, but I'm not sure it's really necessary in this particular case, working with this scene. If I was trying to create an object right up against the ground like this, I would probably spend a bit more time working with our caustics, probably increase the number of photons here as well as the photons there, see what we can get, but I'm not sure that's really necessary with this scene. So I'm not going to worry too much about it. So we've created one material. Let's create our other materials. Now, once again, you would want to Google these values for, say, a ruby or a sapphire or whatever kind of color gem you would want. But if you want to make a color gem, it really is as simple as adjusting the transmission color. So I'll apply this material to, say, the platonic or one of them. Now I can set the transmission color here to whatever I want. And once again, you will want to look up the ABE. Typically with this, lower values will give you more, and that could be important when it comes to kind of our color gems. Because notice if it's at that 55 it was for the diamond, we pretty much lose all of that dispersion, whereas we start to turn it down, we do get perhaps a little bit back. So it is important to try and be realistic in a lot of situations, but ultimately it's what looks good. And so if that means turning this down a little bit more just to get some different values, I personally am okay with that. But I do think at least starting with the realistic values is the way to go. So we can just do something similar here for, say, a green one, apply to the platonic, and now we have our green gem. And once again, you can adjust the transmission colors until you get the desired result. I actually think the diamond here looks the best. Another thing I'll mention is I'm not using kind of the depth or scatter color here. I would use that more for a crystal and less for a gem, if that makes sense. And perhaps I'll do a video at some point about that. But to finish this off, let's kind of create the dynamics portion of this. So what I'm going to do is create a container for my gems. And so this container is going to need to be pretty big. Maybe something like this. Essentially, the gems are going to fill this up. So make this editable, move it up, and I'm probably better off just scaling this up a little bit to elongate it, make it the opening a larger there, and deleting the top so that the gems can go inside. Cool. And this we won't actually be rendering. Just hide it from visibility, but for previewing and setup purposes, I will check X-ray on. Now what we're going to do is put all of our gems in a cloner. And grid array will work just fine with this. We are going to want them on the y-axis as well. That's interesting. Oh, that's because of the pivot point here. So let's go Tools, Axis, Center Axis 2. There we go. And I can create however many I want of these, trying to make sure they're going to fit. So that looks pretty good. That may be pushing it just a bit, at least in terms of the z-axis, but on the y and x, we can certainly create more. So I'll do something like this, do something, like this. Okay, looking good. Can hide that dome light as well, so perhaps we can see things a little bit easier, though the transparent materials certainly aren't helping anything. Couple last things we can do here is switch the clones here to random. That will randomize these. Also going to apply a random effector. So that can randomize the positions, which can be good, but we have to be careful about that because it can also lead to some weird issues with the dynamics. But I'll go into the parameter tab here. I'm less concerned with position, so maybe we just do like 20. Okay, can help if I type 20, but I really just want rotation. So I'll just type in 180 on all three of these, and that should give these different rotations. Actually, I'm going to turn off the materials here just so we can see things a little bit more clearly. Perfect. Awesome. Now what we can do is on our cloner, go to bullet tags and choose rigid body. And on our disk, actually our cube, I lied, back to bullet tags and choose collider body. And now when we hit play, we should see some dynamics. You'll notice how slow this is. If we really want to speed this up, what we can do is go into our cloner, go into the object tab and switch this to render instance or even multi-instance. And now look how much faster that is. Awesome. And you'll notice a few of them kind of start moving, going the wrong way. That's because they're intersecting other objects, and that's what the position is causing. So if I uncheck that, we shouldn't have that issue the next time around. There we go. Now, the last thing I did in my animation, I didn't show you guys the actual animation, is I slowed these down a bit. All right, and actually, well, yeah, I do mind some randomization on the y-axis, but I slowed these down using a friction force. So we can create one of those, increase the strength. I think I had it around 45 or so. And notice how it just slows everything down. Okay, so maybe make this a lot longer. And unfortunately with that, we can see how much longer it takes for everything to fall. But also, you know, we have our position that is pretty generic, right? So randomizing that a bit can help. Maybe even doing this a bit more. All right, we're starting to get some interesting movement in there with the randomizing. You can also add friction to the rotation if you increase the angular strength of the friction. So that can help kind of calm down some of these that are rotating perhaps a bit too fast. But that is essentially it, though really for this friction, I might turn things down just a little bit more so they fall. All I did was position a camera to kind of fill the view. And at this point, we now get all these gems kind of not bouncing, but falling, filling up. And if we were to render this, make sure our cube is set to not render. Go play this back a little bit. We'll do something like this. Really still want to break that up a little bit more with my random effector. Could even use a random field in our friction here to help with that as well. But this is what we should be getting. And look, the one downside to gems, to creating some realistic looking things, is that it's going to take a long time to render. So I don't think I have that image pulled up anymore. Let me try. Yep. So, you know, this image here was taking about 12 minutes a frame on my computer for a 1280 by 720 image. So just keep in mind. And well, what do you know? I don't quite understand why we're getting colored caustics. Well, I guess because we have our colored materials where we didn't before. But that too can help with caustics. But like I said, I don't think we really need it with this particular scene where we do have so many different things falling. We're not seeing a lot of the shadows or the ground where those caustics could come into play. But yeah, that's what we did here. I did forget one thing, so let's finish with that, where in our Redshift camera tag, in the lens effects, we can add a streak. This is one of the few times I think it can actually work pretty good. Let me make sure I check override. And in our options here, we turn on post effects for our perspective view IPR rendering. And what we should get is some nice little streaks in some of the brighter areas. We do have to be a bit careful because if any of our gems see our light, that can be really, really bright. But as I start to turn the threshold down here, we should hopefully see a little bit more of that. And we do, maybe not quite as defined as I would have liked, but you can see there are some streaks here, and that can just make things a little bit more interesting. Though really, we could do something like this in After Effects as well without the risk of ruining our renders here. And what also could be handy for a scene like this, and I'm not going to get into it right now, I've made videos about it previously, would be to maybe use a color user data node to randomize the color of these gems. That would also help. That way you could get the diamond material on all of these, the red material on all of them, and as well as some other colors. So that could be a nice touch. But That will do it for this video. If there's anything else you would like to see, please let me know. And until next time, take care.